In this video, I'm going to be talking about clearing green or cloudy water in a swimming pool relating to the spring opening season. You just opened your pool, or maybe you opened it a little bit ago and you've been trying to clear it. It's not clear. You want to go swimming. What's up? How to fix this? I can help you. I brought my book. I only do this when I've got a lot of notes, and so you know this is going to be a good video. So stick around. We are definitely going to solve your green water problem here. We're just going to go through it systematically. I'm going to explain it in a way that should help make sense to you. And at the end of this, you should know exactly what you need to do to fix your green water. So let's get started here. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is actually something I read about very recently online, and it's something that I'm guilty of doing myself. I don't mention it enough as a pool professional. I don't talk about TDS, or total dissolved solids. And it was an instance where somebody was trying to clear green water in their pool, and they did everything on the list here that I'm going to talk about, and it still wasn't working. What the heck is going on here? And they had too many total dissolved solids in the water. And this just means that the water is old. There's a lot of stuff in it. Every time you put something in the water, you dissolve the solid into the water, that number is going up. And you reach a point where the water becomes unmanageable. There's just too much stuff in it, and it's old, and it's not good, and it doesn't look good, and it doesn't smell good, and it becomes very difficult to chemically manage. And these are the instances where you're doing everything right and you're following all the protocol that you're being given, and it's still not solving the problem. And this is just because it's not something that comes up a whole lot, so we kind of put it at the end of the list and we forget to talk about it. And that's why this time it's first, because you might have this problem. Let's talk about total dissolved solids. How much is too much? Because it's unfortunately a little bit of a complicated subject, as are a lot of things in the pool and spa industry, but let's simplify this. Salt chlorine generator pools, other pools. So other pools should have a maximum of, depending on who you ask, 1,500 to 2,500 parts per million total dissolved solids. So you've got a regular chlorine pool, you have 3,500 parts per million total dissolved solids. Too much. You have a problem. Your pool is very difficult to manage. And so then you would be given a protocol to deal with that, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But for now, salt pools. This is hard because you start by balancing your swimming pool, then you add 3,000 parts per million of salt to the water. So right away, we're over the maximum amount that you would normally drain and refill and make your water clean. And this makes it just a little more complicated for people to understand. And basically, what you do is you kind of change the scale. With a salt pool, you take whatever your clean water is once you've added the salt as your baseline, 1,500 parts per million total dissolved solids. Over that is your maximum. So that's kind of your range to work with. Regular pool, 1,500 to 2,500, that's kind of the cap. With a salt pool, you just start with whatever you start with, and you can end up with 5,000 parts per million total dissolved solids in a salt pool, and it's still working okay. Again, when you put 3,000 parts per million of salt in the water, it kind of changes how you define the total dissolved solids in relation to when you drain and refill. Let's move on. So that's a pretty small thing that doesn't happen to a lot of swimming pools. It's kind of only when the pools are really old and you're not in a seasonal area where you're draining and refilling regularly, which helps to reduce your TDS levels. But when it comes to green water in your pool, and I mean, people don't want to hear this, but fundamentals matter when it comes to water chemistry. And everyone wants to think that their water is special, but probably there's a problem with your fundamental water chemistry in your swimming pool if you have this persistent green water, or else your water would be clean and clear. So really quickly, let's just review what your pool chemistry values should be in this water, what we're going to make them be, and then that's going to fix this water. So first of all, your free chlorine level. You need to be using between 2 to 4 parts per million free chlorine. And you can't tell me like, oh, I like to use less, 0.5 parts per, maybe, I don't know. Try doing that another time. Right now we're trying to fix green water. This is what it takes to fix green water. 2 to 4 parts per million free chlorine. The total chlorine in the water should be exactly equal to the free chlorine level. I'm going to touch more on that in a minute, but that's another measurement. So free chlorine 2 to 4, total chlorine 2 to 4 parts per million. Alkalinity, we have to shoot for 80 to 120 parts per million. I like to shoot towards the upper range of that. And you're like, well, what does all this mean? It means if you test your water and you have 60 parts per million total alkalinity, you need to put baking soda in the water to increase the amount of total alkalinity that you have up towards the, 100 parts per million range would be a good number to shoot for. pH 7.4. And there's a number of reasons why it has to be here. You can't just have a pH of 8.4 plus and say, no, like that's normal for my pool, but I can't clear this green water. It's like, no, that's a problem. You have to fix that because there's chemical interactions and chlorine is not as effective at the higher pH levels. And so that's just part of this. You're going to have to adjust the alkalinity up first, and then that's going to move the pH level. You wait in 12 hours, test the water again, and then likely you're going to have to add acid to the pool to lower the pH back down to 7.4. That's kind of just how this relationship works. The two work together. They're kind of married. When one moves, the other moves. You always adjust the total alkalinity first, give it some time to do its thing, and then you adjust the pH second. That is the protocol. And if you were going to adjust everything in your swimming pool, those are the first things that I'd be adjusting. Moving on. Calcium, you need calcium hardness at 200 to 400 parts per million. It's a very minor footnote on a green water problem, but I'm mentioning it in case your calcium hardness is 2,000 parts per million for some crazy reason. You need to know it needs to be 200 to 400. There's a wider range. You can have up to 1,000, especially in a concrete swimming pool, but you don't want 2,000 or anything like that. 2 to 400 is what we're aiming for here. Phosphates. It's, again, a very complicated subject that I'm going to condense to this. It's a superfood for algae. If you have a problem with green water and you have a problem with phosphates, I think we found the problem. So less than 500 parts per billion is what we're aiming for phosphates. And there's a number of reasons how and why you can end up with them in your pool, and you should investigate why if you have a chronic problem with them. And there's a little bit of argument within online communities about like if this is even relevant to swimming pools. Like, I've owned a pool for 40 years. I never had a problem with phosphates. It's like, well, the world's different now and it's chock full of phosphates, trust me. And it's coming off of like fertilizers and agricultural runoff, and it's contaminating water supplies. It's causing blue-green algae blooms in like isolated lakes and rivers. And it wreaks all sorts of havoc on both nature and your swimming pool. And if you have a crap load of phosphates in your swimming pool, you're going to have a problem with green water. That's just the way it works. So if you have them, you got to get rid of them. They make chemicals for it. Do it. Get them under 500 parts per billion, and this is going to improve your water quality substantially. It's also going to reduce the amount of chlorine you're using by a lot. So this brings me to a very important point. I'm going to list a couple of things here which are like the chronic offenders for why you have persistent green water. Let's get started with those. Cyanuric acid. Put a big star next to this one. This one's a problem. So cyanuric acid is your sunscreen for chlorine. If you didn't use cyanuric acid or stabilizer or water conditioner, it's called sometimes, if you didn't use this in your water, no matter how much chlorine you have, no matter how much, it would all be gone every day. The sun would just burn it all off. So we use 30 to 50 parts per million of cyanuric acid, and this protects the chlorine from just being able to be burned off. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty darn good. Here's the problem. A lot of chlorinated products for use in swimming pools are stabilized chlorine, like a chlorine puck commonly will be stabilized chlorine. And that means it has both the chlorine component, but also cyanuric acid. Every time you put a chlorine puck into the water, you're increasing the cyanuric acid level. When you increase the chlorine count by 1 part per million, you probably increased the cyanuric acid by almost 1 part per million as well. As the number climbs, it becomes a problem. The same way that it kind of protects the chlorine against the sun, it'll super protect it against the sun when you let the levels climb too high. 30 to 50 parts per million, that's what your pool should be. 70 parts per million is good for a saltwater pool. Really, no higher than this. And there's lots of places and even professional companies that will endorse it's okay, have higher COI. I'll touch on that in a second. If you want to not have problems with your pool, set your cyanuric acid to 30 parts per million, 30 to 50 parts per million, and stop using stabilized chlorine products. And then you're never going to have this problem again. You're not going to have to drain and partially refill or use enzymes or alum treatments or anything like that to try to lower your cyanuric acid levels, because conventionally speaking, partially draining and refilling with fresh water is how you deal with cyanuric acid levels which are too high. So touching on that point about cyanuric acid and the people who say it's okay to have higher levels. Yes, and you need to also increase the free chlorine levels along with the cyanuric acid levels. So that 2 to 4 parts per million we were talking about before doesn't apply anymore. We need to maintain, depending on who you ask, between 5% to 7.5% free chlorine to cyanuric acid ratio. I'll give you an example. Our cyanuric acid level is not 30 to 50 parts per million. Now it's 100 parts per million. So we would need between 5.0 parts per million free chlorine up to 7.5 parts per million free chlorine in that water. That's 5 to 7.5% of the cyanuric acid level. Again, depending on who you ask. I don't really prefer this method. I don't like to have my cyanuric acid levels really high, and some people have them super high, 150, 200 parts per million. And then you have to have these crazy high free chlorine levels. And I guess it's okay because, like, I'm not a chemist, right? So I can't tell you the chemical interaction on the molecular level that's happening. I just know that I don't want to have 20 parts per million free chlorine in my pool, but it's okay because it's being like chelated by this cyanuric acid level that's smoking high. And so the whole thing works. It's fine. The water's clear, but my chemical levels are all through the roof. I don't like the sound of that. I don't like it at all. If you want to do it, go ahead. If you're a chemist, you want to explain it to me in a way that makes sense, and then I can endorse it, give it a shot. For me, fix your water 30 to 50 parts per million cyanuric acid, or 70 if you have a salt system. And this is going to solve so many problems. Stop using chlorine pucks, find an alternative source that's unstabilized chlorine, like liquid chlorine is a good one. Chlorine generated from a salt chlorine generator is another. There's cal hypo. There's options. There's options out there that you can find if you go looking for them. So moving on here, from the cyanuric acid level being too high, being a major problem, a major source of green water. A lot of you watching this, if you go test your water right now, this is the problem you have. But moving on, the people who that wasn't their problem is probably this one. So remember I said before, free chlorine 2 to 4, total chlorine has to equal that number. So also 2 to 4. Again, big exclamation point next to this. So combined chlorine, that's not free chlorine. That's different. Free chlorine is in your water floating around ready to do its thing and kill bacteria and oxidize organic debris. Combined chlorine is chlorine, which is already combined with organic debris, for example, and it's no longer free floating around to kill stuff. And it is responsible for a lot of green water, bad water smell, red eyes, like all sorts of these conditions, which people often attribute to, like, oh, I'm allergic to chlorine. It's like, well, what was the combined chlorine level of this water? They can't answer that for you usually. But a lot of times it'll be a high number, and it will be the reason why they get red eyes, itchy skin, the water smells and looks bad, all that stuff. When the total chlorine level and the free chlorine level are not the same, it indicates there's a presence of combined chlorine. The combined chlorine levels are climbing in the water, and we want them to be 0 parts per million combined chlorine. By the time you reach 1 part per million combined chlorine, so it's not a lot, the water looks terrible and it smells bad and it's hard to manage. So, and it can get a lot worse than that, but that's kind of the scale that we work with, is we want free chlorine and total chlorine to be exactly the same. By the time the total chlorine has climbed up to 1 part per million more than the free chlorine, indicating the presence of 1 part per million combined chlorine. This is a problem, and it needs action. And this right here is probably one of the single most confusing parts of pool ownership that people still don't get. I'm going to explain it. It's actually really simple. So 1 part per million combined chlorine. We tested the water. We had 2 parts per million free chlorine, but we had 3 parts per million combined chlorine, or 3 parts per million total chlorine. So that means we have 1 part per million combined chlorine, and we have to get rid of it. So here's how we do that. We have to increase the free chlorine level in this water to be 10 times the combined chlorine level, and we must hold it at that level for a sustained period of time, 12 to 14 hours. So here's how this works. We have 1 part per million combined chlorine. So we need 10 times that amount in free chlorine. So we need 10 parts per million free chlorine. This is not so hard yet. So you put that into the pool, you pour some liquid chlorine, you test the water, you have achieved 10 parts per million free chlorine. We are halfway there. Now you have to hold it there sustained, like overnight or for a whole day that nobody's using the pool, and you're going to go back out a few hours later and test it, and that free chlorine level has dropped. It is no longer it's no longer as high as it was. It's not 10 parts per million anymore. It's only 8 or 6. Don't let it drop. You got to get out there with your chlorine and get it back up there. 10 parts per million. That's what I said. You have to hold it there for 12 to 14 hours. And if you do that, you will get rid of all of that combined chlorine. I know it sounds counterintuitive. There's all this chlorine, and the way you get rid of it is you just keep adding more and more and more. I know it sounds so weird, but that's how it works. So we just covered the most confusing part of owning a swimming pool and taking care of the water chemistry, talking about the difference between free chlorine, total chlorine, and how we want combined chlorine always to be equal to 0 and never any more than 1 part per million. And we deal with it by increasing the free chlorine to be 10 times the combined chlorine level. So what if the combined chlorine level was only 0.5 parts per million? It's not 10 yet. It's only 0.5 parts per million. To get rid of it, you would take the free chlorine level and you would make it be 10 times that combined chlorine level, which in this case would be 5 parts per million free chlorine, and you would ensure to hold it there at that level for 12 to 14 hours. If you do that, you're going to fix your green water for sure. Moving along. So, there's a couple of other things which have to be working here. Like we've talked about all this stuff, like I just talked about that free chlorine, combined chlorine. If you have that and you're like, oh, I'm going to fix it, all that other stuff I talked about still has to be right. Like your pH has to be right, alkalinity, all those things. You can't just do the one thing and go, oh, it didn't fix my water. Well, if you're going to make all those corrections, that's great, but make sure that you balance your alkalinity first, followed by your pH, and then let's talk about the chlorine situation. Because really, if your pH is 8.4, really your pH could be anything, because a lot of testing methods really can't go above 8.4. They say 8.4, but what they mean is, I don't know, could be anything. It's higher than 8.4. And chlorine is not effective at high pH. It's barely effective at a pH of 7.4, where we keep it in swimming pools. It's just that it's a function of the chemistry behind it. It really is most effective at a pH of like 4, like strong coffee or something like that. But at a pH of 8.4 or 9 or who knows what, it's hardly doing anything at all in the water. I mean, it's there. You could test it, you could measure it, but it's not able to do its job. And that's why all this stuff has to work together. And you have to start looking at the numerical values for your water chemistry. You can't just dunk a test strip, look at the color and go, yeah, it's orange. It's good, right? pH is good. pH is never good. pH is always a numerical value. If you look on the test strips closely, it even says the numerical values in there, but let's be realistic. Test strips is just about the worst way to try to measure pH. It will give you an approximation at best, and then you try to determine that based on the light that you're in and your ability to discern color differences. So it's not super effective. There's a lot of better ways that you could test your pH. At-home test kits with a Taylor test kit is just about the best way that you can do it, or go to a pool and spa store and take advantage of their free water testing. Moving on. The last thing I'll mention about the green water from the chemistry perspective is, if we've done everything else and it's still cloudy water, there could be something wrong with the interior surface of this pool. Do you have a concrete pool which has been painted? That could be the problem right there, because the telltale sign of a paint which has reached the end of its service life is that it's chalking, and if you brush it, it's just like big clouds. It immediately clouds the waters. The paint's failing. I mean, a lot of people say you should never paint a concrete pool. That's one of the reasons why. That's a long and technical conversation we could have another time. But the reality is it might be responsible for the water in your pool. And if you don't have a painted pool, do you have a concrete pool that's got a very old and rough interior surface? That gives a lot of place for bacteria and organic debris to hide and cling to and fight to not be, contacted by the chlorine or picked up by the filtration system. So you have to maintain your pool, really, no matter what kind it is, even as much as just the interior surface itself could be responsible for cloudy water. But we're getting down to kind of just a few percent here. We've covered most of the stuff responsible for cloudy water. Run your filtration system 24/7. Even if you're a penny pincher and you're like, I'm not going to do that, it's really expensive. Fine, let's talk about that later. And I definitely think you should run your system 24/7, and using a variable speed pump, it does not cost you an arm and a leg. In fact, it'll save you money over whatever you're doing right now with a single speed pump. But the reality is, regardless of what kind of pump you have to be running the system 24/7 right now because your pool looks like crap and we got to fix it. Filtration is one of the most important ways that we do it. But you have to be aware of a few things here because there's a lot of junk in your water right now, and we could be jamming up your filter with debris, and it might need service and maintenance as a result. So it's definitely something that you need to be aware of as part of this cleaning a green pool situation. Let's talk about it a little bit. You need to know the clean operational pressure of your system. It's information you need to have. And what that means is after you clean your filter, whatever kind of filter you have, DE, cartridge, or sand filter, they all have a pressure gauge on them. This pressure gauge is telling you what the system's operating at, and it's a very important piece of instrumentation. It's basically the only piece of instrumentation you get for your swimming pool. And most people ignore them and let them break and fail and whatever, but they're so helpful. They're everything you need to know about when to clean your filter. So let's start with a clean system. You've just cleaned your filter. Either you did it or you paid somebody to do it, but the filter's clean right now. Now you need to know what the pressure is on the system because this is your clean operational pressure. It's a number unique to only your pool and nobody can tell you what it is. You have to clean your filter and then you have to look at the instrumentation gauge and see what the pressure is. It's going to be somewhere between 0 to 30. It can never be more than 30 in a pool system, or turn off the pump and investigate the problem. Lower number is better than higher number because it indicates less resistance to flow, aka more efficiency to the system. We're going to choose a number here, 10 psi. Your system, clean operational pressure, is 10 psi. So it is time to clean your filter, regardless of what kind of filter you have, when the pressure increases above your clean operational pressure. How much above depends on who you're asking and what kind of sand filter you have. Sorry, what kind of filter you have. But commonly, with a sand filter, about 7 psi is what I recommend. Really, no more than that. And I'm kind of recommending that as like the maximum. Like, oh no, you have to do it now. If it's 2 or 3 psi up, and you're wondering, could I clean it now and would it benefit? It would, because it's already a couple of psi above your clean operational pressure, indicating that the filter media is getting dirty. Cartridge filter, DE filter, again, it's all kind of the same thing. 7 to 10 psi above the clean operational pressure is the maximum, and the lower the number, the more often you're doing the filter cleanings, the better, because then your system is operating more efficiently. When you're doing a treatment for green water, you could have a tinge of green or you could have palm trees growing in the water. I don't really know. So you need to be aware that the more plant material you have in the water, the more you're going to have to keep an eye on this filter. You could be talking hours in between jamming up the filter with a bunch of dead algae. So that's something that you need to be aware of. But for the average pool just opening for the year, it shouldn't be a worst case scenario. This should just be like a little difficulty with some persistent green water. You might have to clean the filter once or twice, but here's an important note. On the really bad pools, you'll do flock treatment. Flock treatment is basically, it's a flocculant's going to take everything that's in the water that we don't want there, and it's going to coagulate them all together, and it's going to sink to the bottom. You apply this treatment, you circulate your water, you turn off the pump overnight, you let all the stuff sink to the bottom, and then you vacuum to waste in the morning. Now, it's more complicated than that, and you have to be careful because flock treatments could damage your filter if you have the wrong kind of filter. You're supposed to take your filter offline. Like a cartridge filter shouldn't be exposed to this at all. So you have to open it and take the cartridge filter elements out and put it back together, and it's a pain in the butt. A sand filter is a little easier because you can just hit it over to the recirculate on the dial, and that's just going to bypass your filter media altogether. But this is kind of stuff that like pool professionals do. The average homeowner is not doing flock treatments, and you probably don't need to be doing them either. But I'm making you aware that this is something that also exists, and we use these on pools that need to be cleaned very quickly, pools which are very bad in terms of organic contaminants. Maybe it's a pool that has kind of like a minimally adequate plumbing and filtration system, and it's just not able to clean this really green water. Big pool, small system, bad pipes, like all this kind of stuff can work against you. Old filter media, like 20-year-old sand, could be a problem. People often jump to changing the sand in their filter or upgrading it to glass or doing something like that because their water's green. I've had green water for 2 weeks and I can't fix it. Maybe the filter's broken. Maybe the filter is broken, but like let's put a number to it. Like 0.1% of the time that's the problem. But 25% of the time a proactive pool owner decides to change the sand in their filter. More often than not, this will induce a problem with already fragile laterals and internal components on a filter which have already been exposed to years of chemically treated water. And more than not, you end up spending the first month of pool ownership cleaning sand into the bottom of your pool, calling around, researching, trying to fix a persistent problem. The pool went green again, even worse than before. It's almost never your filter. Just run your system. If those pressures that we talked about earlier is everything looks good, you were at 10 psi, went to 15, you cleaned it, it went back down, everything's looking good for a little while, you don't have a problem. Everything's good with your filter. Just run it. Is glass better than sand? Yeah, like probably. Do you need it? No, definitely not. So I would put that well down the list. And if you are a person with a pool with green water and you're like, oh, I was going to change the sand on my filter next weekend because I think maybe that's the problem. I can all but guarantee you that is not the problem here. Like, for example, have you even degreased the sand? There are cleaners that you can use. That commonly you use them on cartridge filter cleanings. If you just hose off your cartridge filters, you are not cleaning them. We found a problem. And if you have a sand filter and you're not degreasing it, boom, another problem as well. So let's talk about this for a second. The amount of crud in a filter is crazy. Um, you need to clean it, and the big offender is oil, grease, suntan lotion, makeups, sprays. Like all of these oil-based things are a problem. They congeal in the filter. Cartridge filters, they're paper. So if you rinse them with your garden hose, you rinsed off none of those oils. The paper is saturated with oil, and you need to use a degreaser product. They make them you should go to a pool and spa store. You should buy a filter cleaner product. That's my first recommendation. If you live on the moon and you need to make your own, you can use 5 gallons of hot water to 1 cup of granular dishwasher detergent, phosphate free. Nothing fancy, just the basic stuff. That combo. Make as much of it as you need to fill a giant garbage can that you're going to submerge the filters in for a couple of hours, then rinse them off. That's how you remove all the oils from a cartridge filter. With a sand filter, people largely don't even realize that there's a degreasing process. If you've had a sand filter for 20 years, you've probably never degreased it. In the world of commercial pools, we have to do this because the sand just gets simply overloaded with the amount of crap on the bathers that come into the water. Like, it is what it is, right? And when you degrease a sand filter, you're going to get like decades worth of crud and broken down oils coming out of there, and you can't imagine how substantially more effective your filtration will be once you've removed all of those things from the system. Your clean operational pressure is going to go down even. I mean, these are fundamental parts of filter maintenance. And if this is all sounding new to you, like you have a cartridge filter, you have a sand filter, and you're not doing any of the stuff that I just talked about, we found the problem. Go do it now. This is going to fix your problem. If you have a DE filter and you're like, why am I not talking about DE filters? I'm just not an expert with DE filters by any means. They are literally unheard of where I am located. And I'm, in Ontario, Canada, but I've also been out to the Pacific Northwest, and basically across Canada, we don't use DE filters. They are very effective filters, but they use diatomaceous earth as the filter media, and they require, regular maintenance. And it's more so just handling DE it's not ideal. And in Canada, I think maybe it's a little more restricted than the US, because some parts of the US, DE filters are the best thing going and people love them. And they are the best in terms of the amount of fine particulate they can remove from the water, but also, to me, they're not convenient to work with, and I just don't know a lot about them, and that's why I don't speak about them as an authority. If you have one, find somebody else to be an authority about your DE filter, or change it out for a cartridge filter, which is what I recommend to do. Vacuuming to waste. This is important. So if you have a bunch of debris in your pool or green stuff, or you're hitting it with chlorine and you're finding a bunch of, stuff on the floor of your pool, dead algae that you've killed, when you vacuum that, don't vacuum it into your filter, regardless of what kind of filter you have. If you do that, you basically just plug up the filter. You immediately have to clean your filter. You need a vacuum to waste option. Sand filters, commonly speaking, have this built in. The multi-port valve has a waste option. You turn off the pump, you set it to waste, you turn on the pump, you prime your vacuum, and now you're vacuuming to waste, and it's going at a hard plumb backwash line or one of those blue roll flat discharge lines. Bob's your uncle. So if you have a cartridge filter, you need to have a provision hard plumbed into your system where you have a three-way valve in between your pump and your filter. And this will give you an option to direct the water somewhere else, like a hard plumbed backwash line or one of those roll flat lines, but not into your cartridge filter, because cleaning cartridge filters is not super convenient, not something you want to have to do all the time, and you shouldn't if your cartridge filter is suitably sized to your swimming pool. There are some areas in the southern US which use very, very small cartridge filters, single canister, 100, 200 square foot maximum, and we don't do that pretty much anywhere else. And it increases the amount of workload that you have to do for filter maintenance. In my area, with a 400 or 500 square foot cartridge filter, even on a large pool, we'll go 3 to 4 months between needing to do filter cleanings. Every pool is different. I'm just giving you some average numbers to work with there. So yeah, we definitely see a lot less filter maintenance when you increase the size of your cartridge filter. It's kind of like the main advantage of increasing the size of your cartridge filter. If you have a tiny, tiny single canister cartridge filter and a moderately big pool, maybe think about upgrading that. So we've talked about basically everything here. Basically everything has been covered in terms of the common stuff, the fundamental stuff, the uncommon stuff, the chronic offenders for green water. I really think that somewhere in what we've just discussed is the solution to your green water problem. And I guess maybe just at the final thing here, yes, there are a very small amount of people who have a broken filter and you don't know that you have a broken filter. You have a broken lateral in your sand filter and you have sand coming back to the pool. You're not filtering water properly. If you have a cartridge filter and the elements are old and plugged or they have holes in them, you're not filtering your water properly. But very, very small amount of you, most of you, almost all of you, this is a chemical problem. Start at the beginning of this. Actually, this is a great idea. Get your water tested, get the full workup done, go to the beginning of this video with your pen and paper, sit down, follow along, find the problem, and let's fix it together. I hope you found this information helpful. And if you did, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can check out my website, swimmingpoolsteve.com.